Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time long before royalty had velvet beds, wigs, and emotionally repressed courtiers. No castles. No palaces. Just ice, stone, and the kind of silence you can only get when you're high up in the Alps, and the nearest town won't exist for another 4,000 years. So if you're tucked in, perhaps with something warm nearby, maybe a mug, maybe a pet, maybe just a blanket that feels like one, let your breathing slow. Let the lights dim. Because tonight's story isn't just about a person. It's about a body. A murder. And the strange little clues that kept a man's final moments frozen in time for, well, eternity. Welcome to the quietly unsettling life and death of Ötzi the Iceman. Let's begin. Ötzi, as we've come to call him, wasn't a prince, a lord, or even a distant noble with a poorly managed manor. He was a guy. A guy who lived 5,300 years ago in what is now the border between Austria and Italy. And yes, he is technically Europe's oldest known murder victim. It's not often a cold case brings new evidence after 5 millennia. Before he was Ötzi, though, he was just a 45-ish-year-old man with thinning hair, arthritis, and an impressive tattoo collection that most modern hipsters would envy. There's no official name given, of course. The nickname Ötzi was bestowed because he was found in the Ötztal Alps. Which is probably better than naming him something like Frosty Chad or Alpine Dave. In the autumn of 1991, 2 hikers spotted something brownish poking out of a melting glacier about 10,530 feet above sea level. At first, they assumed it was the body of a recently deceased mountaineer. Which, frankly, is a fair assumption. The Alps are not known for gentle outcomes. But the jacket wasn't synthetic. The skin was not decomposed. And there was no modern equipment to be found. Just, a man in a kind of eternal nap, face down in the ice. It was a very old nap. Let's drift into the part where everyone did what humans always do in these situations, they made the situation worse. Ötzi was first poked at with a ski pole. Then hauled out with a jackhammer. Pulled, thawed, and dragged before anyone checked if this was archaeology or, a missing hiker. One of the people involved even snapped off part of his hip bone while trying to remove him. So yes, Europe's best preserved mummy had his femur fractured by someone trying to pose him for a better look. Naturally. Scientists eventually realized that he wasn't a lost climber from the 1930s. He was older. Much older. He predated the invention of writing, the pyramids, and almost all recorded history. They had just removed a Copper Age man from his natural resting place, like a very rude fridge raid. Now imagine being that man. One moment you're in the mountains, possibly dying horribly. The next, you're being hauled through customs and getting your own climate-controlled refrigerator in a museum laboratory while everyone stares at your stomach contents under microscopic slides and calls you Ötzi. The good news is, officially, Ötzi was in excellent shape for someone who had been dead since before the Bronze Age. He had grass-woven shoes stuffed with bear fur. A finely crafted copper axe. Some arrows. A bow that he never finished carving. And a collection of tattoos, 61 to be precise, mostly small dashes and lines near joints and along his spine. Was he an ancient shaman? A proto-tattoo influencer? Most likely, no. The lines match acupuncture points, so this was probably an early version of pain management. Which means Ötzi invented back pain solutions before memory foam mattresses were even a thought. Meanwhile, scientists managed to study everything, his face, his organs, his last meal, even his genetics. They found he was lactose intolerant, had heart disease, parasites, cavities, and bad knees. Basically, Ötzi was the original 45-year-old man. Googling, should my shoulder do that? It's oddly comforting. Even 5,000 years ago, people fell apart after 40. Let's drift into the murder. For years, scientists assumed he simply got caught in a storm and died of exposure. A sad, but reasonable, alpine ending. But then, in 2001, after a decade of being thawed and examined, someone noticed an arrowhead lodged in Ötzi's left shoulder. That'll do it. Turns out, Ötzi didn't just trip and fall. He had been shot from behind. The arrow tore a hole into an artery, meaning he likely bled out quickly and died soon after. And if that weren't dramatic enough, someone also bashed him in the head. No one's sure if that happened before he died or after, but it's not a good look for whoever administered the blow. Suddenly, this is no longer a standard prehistoric death. This is a murder mystery. The oldest in Europe. The kind with all the elements: a fleeing victim, an unfinished bow, a hurried final meal, and a corpse left in the wild. It's a cold case. Literally. And scientists are still arguing about what actually happened. Let's take a step back and ask, who was Ötzi? And what exactly got him murdered? Ötzi was likely someone important. Not a king, there were no kings, but possibly a clan leader or high-status individual. The copper axe suggests wealth. Copper was rare. Expensive. And definitely not standard equipment for a hiking dad in the mountains. He also had a quiver full of arrows, only 2 of which were completed. The others were still under construction. That's not ideal. Imagine heading out into the mountains with a weapon that's only 15% ready. It's like carrying a gun with no bullets. Symbolic, but not terribly practical. Some experts think he was ambushed. Others believe he had just survived a fight in the valley before retreating into the mountains to hide. They've found defensive wounds. They found blood from several other people on his tools. He was carrying a chunk of someone else's arrow. In modern terms, Ötzi may have been on the lam. And so, he ran. He climbed. He reached the icy pass. And then someone caught up and shot him in the back. No mercy. No honor. Just a prehistoric, you're done. Let's pause and float into a thought. Ötzi died alone. High in the mountains. He was preserved not by funerary tradition or divine reward, but by sheer luck. Ice fell at the right moment. Frost sealed him in. There was no burial. No one came back. No one mourned in the way we understand mourning. He was a human. A person with a voice. A favorite food. Annoying habits. Maybe he told jokes. Maybe he hummed while he worked. Maybe he hated hiking. And for 5,000 years, his body waited silently for someone to look at him and ask, what happened? And now, here we are, with his stomach contents digitally analyzed and his microbiome sequenced, still asking the same question. Probably more intrusively than he'd have liked. For his last meal, Ötzi ate ibex and red deer meat, along with einkorn wheat bread and some roots. It was a pretty hearty and protein-based meal. Think of it as the paleo diet, but, actually. Paleo. He also had remnants of burned birch in his intestines, probably medicinal. Which is a polite way of saying he may have eaten charcoal to feel better. We've all been there. Then there's the whole thing with his lineage. Ötzi's DNA shows he has living descendants. Thousands of them, mostly in Austria and northern Italy. There are also some unusual genetic quirks. He had a rare blood type, had predispositions to heart disease, and was intolerant to dairy. That last bit really does help humanize him. The first known murder victim in Europe was also someone who couldn't handle cheese. Relatable. He's also part of a genetic subgroup called the K1 mitochondrial haplogroup, now almost extinct. Which kind of makes him the last of his people, in a way. A final representative of a branch that never quite made it. Let's drift lightly into the controversy. Some say Ötzi was a chieftain. Others believe he was an outcast. And while scientists generally enjoy confirmation over speculation, they've spent over 30 years speculating anyway. There was the idea that he was a victim of ritual sacrifice. That theory didn't go far. Mostly because ancient people didn't usually offer up the person with the nice copper axe. That's still true today. Nobody sacrifices the guy with the iPhone. Another theory suggests he was in a leadership role and was killed during a power struggle. Perhaps a younger, more ambitious rival saw him as a threat. After all, an arrow in the back isn't exactly a polite duel. It's a goodbye. The hard way. But the truth? We'll never really know. We can reconstruct narrative after narrative, but that's all they are. Stories draped over bones and fibers. Which isn't so different from what we're doing tonight. Let's close part 1 with a soft pivot. Ötzi wasn't royalty. He wasn't rich in the way we think of wealth. No portraits. No tapestries. Just tools, tattoos, and a well-preserved corpse. But he marks the starting line for our theme tonight. Because as we drift ahead in history, into gilded palaces and weary dynasties, one thing remains the same. People live. People die. And sometimes, the universe preserves their worst days so the rest of us can stare and wonder. So let your breath slow as we float away from the cold peaks of the Alps. We'll leave Ötzi where he probably wanted to be, up high, alone, surrounded by silence and stars. Next, we'll step forward a few thousand years, to kings and queens who had much more gold, and arguably much less common sense. But for now, just linger in the quiet. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of royal history. Someplace where the trumpets have already faded, the armies have marched off, and the crown has just rolled off a severed political career and landed, rather awkwardly, on the floor. Because tonight, we're not talking about kings. We're talking about the people who were left behind when kings fell, their children. The princes who never got to sit on their thrones. The princesses who were suddenly downgraded from, Your Grace, to, Please don't arrest me. The small, confused toddlers who woke up one morning to discover that everyone was whispering now, and no one would explain why the guards suddenly looked different, or angrier. So, if you're ready, maybe dim the lights, settle a little deeper under the blankets, and let's drift through the long, accidental history of royal kids who became political baggage the moment their fathers lost the crown. Because for most royal children, the fall of a king. To talk about after dark. So, let's drift through a few stories, quietly, and meet some of the small humans who had the misfortune of being born into the wrong dynasty at the wrong time. Let's drift first to medieval England, to two boys in a tower. You probably already know the story, though it's usually told with more drama and fewer yawns. But tonight, we're keeping everything soft, slow, and just gently unfortunate. The year is 1483. King Edward IV has died unexpectedly, leaving behind two sons, 12-year-old Edward, the new king, and 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. These boys were more or less the royal equivalent of those bright hotel lobby vases that everyone pretends to love but secretly hopes will not be their responsibility. Edward IV's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, suddenly decided that he was perhaps inexplicably and mystically destined to rule England himself. This was a very common condition among medieval uncles. Richard placed both boys in the Tower of London, officially for safekeeping, which medieval rulers said the way modern people say, I might have accidentally deleted something important. The boys were last seen playing in the courtyard. After that, nothing. No escape. No rebellion. No surviving diary entries that say something helpful like, please stop putting us in towers. Just silence. The new king, Richard III, insisted everything was fine. Everyone else pretended to believe him. And the princes simply became one of history's quiet unanswered questions. Their fall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly loud. It was just the gentle erasure of two children whose father lost the throne, and took their future with him. Next, let's drift to France. Where royal children suffered from a different problem entirely, they survived, which was inconvenient for everyone. Take the children of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The French Revolution did not believe in half measures. When they removed a king, they made sure the removal was decisive, permanent, and executed with the kind of bureaucratic enthusiasm that only committees can summon. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had 4 children, though 2 died young. Their surviving son, Louis Charles, was 8 when the revolutionaries decided he was dangerous. Which is a strong word to apply to a child whose main political strategy was crying. After the king and queen were executed, Louis Charles became a problem. Because technically, in the eyes of royalists, he was now King Louis XVII. The revolutionaries solved this awkwardness by, well, locking him in a dark room. Alone. For years. A child. In solitary confinement. He was not allowed fresh air, schooling, or human affection, because affection, apparently, was politically suspicious now. He died at age 10. The official cause was illness, but the unofficial cause was everything. His sister, Marie-Therese, was luckier. Instead of being locked in a cell, she was traded, like slightly distressed royal furniture, for political prisoners held by Austria. She spent years trying to figure out who she was allowed to be now. Not a princess. Not a peasant. Just a survivor of a monarchy that had collapsed on top of her. Now, let's drift east, to Russia. Where royal children had a talent for being inconvenient. The Romanovs specialized in dramatic endings, though we'll keep things soft and quiet tonight. Long before the fall of Nicholas II, Russian history had already built up a strong resume of royal child mishandling. Take Ivan VI. A baby who accidentally became Emperor of Russia at 2 months old, which is excessive responsibility even by royal standards. He was immediately overthrown by Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, who politely decided she'd rather rule herself. Rather than harming the baby, which would have been rude, even for 18th century politics, she simply locked him away. But not in a sad Victorian orphan story sort of way. More like an eternally misplaced library book sort of way. Ivan spent his entire life, 23 years, moving from prison to prison. He grew up without toys, tutors, or friends. Whenever guards reported that he was kind, or quiet, or showed signs of intelligence, officials became nervous. Intelligent imprisoned princes were not fashionable. Eventually, he was murdered during a failed rescue attempt. A rescue attempt he didn't even know was happening. A child who became a king before he learned to walk, and a prisoner before he learned to speak. All because the wrong relative put on a crown at the wrong moment. Let's drift further back in time, to the world of the Byzantine Empire. A place where royal children grew up surrounded by marble, mosaics, religious chants, and the constant probability that someone was plotting against them during lunch. Take the case of Michael III's young son. Or the sons of Constantine VI. Or the many boys who had the misfortune of being crowned co-emperor at age 4, because Byzantines thought giving toddlers political titles was somehow stabilizing. These children often found themselves deposed, blinded, or quietly retired to monasteries. Monasteries, in medieval politics, were the equivalent of saying, "We're not killing you, but please never leave this building." Little princes spent their days copying manuscripts, contemplating theology, and trying to forget that they once technically ruled a quarter of the known world. Imagine being 7 and exiled to a monastery for political reasons. Imagine not even understanding the politics. Imagine being told, gently, by a monk, "No, dear, you can't be emperor anymore. Brother Gregory is in charge now." It was a soft ending. A quiet one. But no less final. And now, let's drift to the Mongol Empire. Where royal children dealt with an entirely different problem: they had too many fathers. Not biologically. Politically. When a Khan died, succession involved uncles, brothers, cousins, and ambitious steppe aristocrats who all believed, quite sincerely, that they were uniquely qualified to rule the largest land empire on earth. The sons of defeated Khans usually faced 3 fates. Absorption into another branch of the family, which was basically like being adopted by the people who had just conquered your parents. Political hostage status, which meant living in a tent so luxurious that you sometimes forgot you were, technically, imprisoned. Vanishing into the steppe, which is a poetic way of saying, we're not sure what happened but it probably wasn't great. Royal children in the Mongol world were rarely killed outright. They were too valuable. Too symbolic. Too dynasty-shaped. But their lives were often defined by who controlled them. Your father fell. Your uncle now raised you. Another uncle wanted you dead. A third uncle might adopt you. A fourth uncle wanted to marry you into his line, if you happened to be a daughter. A fifth uncle might offer you a pony. It was complicated. But quietly complicated. Let's drift west again, this time to Scotland. Where small royal children developed a survival strategy called, grow up in another country. James I of Scotland, captured as a boy, imprisoned by the English for 18 years. James II, king at age 6, controlled by noble factions for most of his childhood. James III, also became king as a child. James V, king at age 1. Scottish princes had a life cycle something like: born. Crown placed on head before they could speak. Noble regents start arguing. Child becomes a symbol. Someone inevitably sends them abroad, for safety. They return years later, confused but polite. Children of fallen Scottish kings sometimes survived surprisingly well, mostly because everyone was too busy fighting each other to harm them directly. Chaos is dangerous, but it is also, occasionally, protective. And now, let's drift to the softest of all fates, exile. Many children of overthrown kings simply became wanderers. Not peasants. Not nobles. Not quite royalty. Just people carrying a royal surname that made border guards nervous. The children of the deposed Portuguese Braganzas. The Spanish Bourbons after Napoleon. The children of African kings displaced by colonial powers. Indian princely heirs shipped to England for education. Persian princes sent to Paris. Ottoman princes exiled to France, where they discovered cafes, cigarettes, and the strange modern feeling of being irrelevant. Life in exile could be almost normal. Almost. But every passport, every letter, every polite conversation carried the quiet reminder that somewhere out there was a throne that used to be theirs and now belonged to someone else. No armies were chasing them. No towers were waiting. No prisons. Just a long, slow life spent not being what they were born to be. A soft ending. A tired one. But perhaps the kindest of all. So what happened to the children of fallen kings? Well, everything. And nothing. They were hidden. Protected. Imprisoned. Exiled. Married off. Forgotten. Or turned, accidentally, into symbols of rebellions they never asked for. Some grew up to be kings after all. Some became monks. Some became rumors. Some became history's long echo of what might have been. Most were just children, small, frightened, confused, trying to survive the political collapse of the adults around them. They didn't fall with their fathers. But they lived in the rubble. And in the quiet. Always the quiet. Part 2. What happened to the children of fallen kings? Hey everyone. Let's settle back in, maybe adjust your pillow, maybe let your breathing slow a little. Because tonight, we're still wandering through the quieter corners of royal history, the places where lost crowns echo softly, and where the children left behind had to figure out what it meant to grow up in a world that no longer had space for them. In the first part, we drifted through towers, monasteries, exiles, and a few more prisons than anyone really needs before bedtime. But we're not done yet. Because the fall of a king didn't just reshape the lives of his children during childhood. It followed them into adulthood too, shaping who they married, where they lived, what they were allowed to say, and, occasionally, whether they were allowed to say anything ever again. So let's keep drifting. Softly. Quietly. Through the long shadow cast by a fallen crown. Let's move back for a moment to a kingdom that always seemed to fall apart at exactly the wrong time, England. We tend to imagine English princes growing up in warm, well-lit palaces, surrounded by knights and tutors who said things like, "Your Highness, perhaps don't poke the tapestry with that dagger." But for the children of fallen kings, the castle walls weren't comforting. They were warning labels. Take Henry VI, the chronically unlucky king who lost his throne twice and spent the rest of his life proving that mental illness and medieval politics were a disastrous combination. His only son, Prince Edward of Westminster, was raised like a child who was already a political slogan. People whispered that the Queen ruled in his name. People whispered that he wasn't even Henry's biological child. People whispered a lot, medieval people loved whispering, and none of it helped a young boy who just wanted to throw a javelin and be left alone. Prince Edward grew up in exile. France, Scotland, back to France, then back to England. His father's crown came off like a loose button, and every time it fell, Edward's life tilted a little more. By age 17, he wasn't just a prince, he was a symbol of a civil war. And symbols rarely get happy endings. He died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Some say he fell in combat. Some say he was executed afterward. Some say he annoyed the wrong nobleman. The accounts vary, which usually means the truth wasn't flattering. Prince Edward never sat on the throne. He barely sat still. His whole life was spent moving, a wandering heir following a wandering crown. Let's drift a little south, to the sunlit courts of Spain. Spain produced some of the most tragic royal children in Europe, not because they were violently deposed, but because they were delicately undermined. Take the children of Queen Joanna, better known, somewhat rudely, as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Now, Joanna probably wasn't mad. She was more likely depressed, isolated, manipulated, or all three. But medieval men had a very specific way of describing women who didn't do what they wanted. Ah yes, she must be insane. When Joanna's husband died, the charming, unfaithful, politically gifted Philip the Handsome, her mental health collapsed. Naturally, the men of the family saw this as a political opportunity. Her children were quietly taken from her. One by one. Her oldest son, Charles, was raised to rule an empire. Her daughters were sent to convents or political marriages. Joanna herself was locked away in a monastery for nearly 50 years, not because she was dangerous, but because her existence was politically inconvenient. And her children? Well, they grew up with power, yes. But also with the knowledge that their rise had required their mother's disappearance. Fallen kings were one thing. A fallen queen was another. And her children lived in the shadow of a decision that none of them had been old enough to understand. Now let's float east again, to the glittering but brittle world of
chimneys, the medieval game changer. Now, at some point, humanity decided that maybe, just maybe, all the smoke in the living room was a problem. That's when the chimney entered the chat. Chimneys began appearing in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, first in monasteries and wealthy homes. It was a total revolution in heating. Instead of one smoky hearth in the middle of a room, you could now have multiple fireplaces on different floors, each with a flue that carried smoke neatly out of the building. The downside? Chimneys were expensive to build, tricky to maintain, and had an unfortunate habit of catching fire. Still, they were a huge step up from, let's just make a bonfire indoors and hope for the best. Castles like Dover and Kenilworth in England eventually got elaborate chimney systems, with fireplaces big enough to roast an ox, which, coincidentally, was sometimes exactly what they were used for. The warming pan and other medieval inventions, even with fireplaces, bedrooms could still feel like meat lockers. That's where a few clever little tools came in. One was the warming pan, a small metal pan with a long handle filled with hot coals and slid between the bed sheets before sleeping. Think of it as a 14th century electric blanket, minus the electricity, and plus a small risk of setting your mattress on fire. Then there were foot warmers, little boxes with embers placed under your feet while you sat, and bed socks, though they didn't call them that, of course. They just wore layers until movement became optional. For the wealthy, fur-lined robes and heavy cloaks were essential indoor fashion. You didn't wear your house wore you.
Some warriors. Some traders. Some simply lived quiet lives in the same towns their fathers once ruled. A fallen king's child here didn't always lose status. Sometimes, they gained a new one untouched by the responsibilities or expectations of ruling. It was one of the few places where a royal child might look at their father's downfall and think, well, this might actually be an improvement. Now let's drift into the world of the Holy Roman Empire, a place so politically chaotic that even historians sometimes need a nap afterward. Here, kings fell often, mostly because there were too many people who thought they were kings. When an emperor was deposed, his children were rarely imprisoned. They were reclassified. A royal son might become a duke, a margrave, a prince-bishop, or, in particularly bureaucratic cases, a count of something recently invented. Royal daughters were married off to neighboring states as quickly as humanly possible, usually to secure the family's next political gamble. The children of fallen emperors didn't disappear. They just slid sideways into different political boxes. Sometimes they rose again. Sometimes they didn't. But they rarely died for their father's crown. They just adjusted their titles. Medieval Europe loved titles. It had more titles than common sense. Next, let's wander up to Scandinavia, where monarchies rose and fell the way snowdrifts shift in the wind, quietly, slowly, and with minimal paperwork. Children of fallen kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were often fostered by noble families, raised in comfortable obscurity until someone decided whether they were a problem or not. Many lived perfectly normal lives. Or as normal as one can live when one's name still opens castle doors. Some became knights. Some clerics. Some even became merchants, which medieval nobles considered slightly embarrassing but not fatal. But occasionally, one child would return. Like a quiet ghost. Like a rumor with better posture. But occasionally, one child would return. Like a quiet ghost. Like a rumor with better posture. Claiming a throne. Reviving an old claim. Starting a gentle, well-mannered civil war. Scandinavian civil wars were famously polite. Many ended with treaties that basically said, let's just share the crown and take turns. This created some very confused children of very confused fallen kings. But confusion, at least, was not fatal. Now let's drift back into France, because France always has one more tragic royal child waiting in the wings. This time, it's the children of Napoleon. Now, Napoleon did not technically fall. He more slid down the political staircase, loudly, twice. His son, Napoleon II, was taken to Austria and raised by a grandfather who preferred him safely hidden behind curtains. He grew up in luxury. But never learned French properly. Never saw a battlefield. Never ruled anything larger than his own schedule. He died at 21, consumed by tuberculosis, and by the weight of a name too large for one boy to carry. His father had ruled Europe. He ruled his bedroom. This was one of the softest, saddest forms of political erasure, the kind that replaces power not with prisons, but with polite suffocation. And finally, let's drift to the quietest fate of all, the children who simply chose to disappear. Some royal children, after losing everything, walked away. They changed their names. They became scholars, merchants, priests, poets, people who bought bread without anyone bowing. Some lived longer than any of the kings who replaced their fathers. Some lived happier. Some lived anonymously. Some lived freely for the first time. A fallen king's child did not always fall. Sometimes they landed somewhere softer, somewhere human. So what happened to the children of fallen kings? Everything. And also, nothing unusual. They were protected, imprisoned, adopted, tucked away, lost, found, married off, forgotten, or quietly transformed into someone entirely different.
Hey guys! Tonight we're leaving the drawbridges down and the lights dimmed. Because tonight's story isn't about wars or glory or coronations. It's about silence. About what happens when all that power, all that silk, marble and ceremony, quietly turns against the people living inside it. So if you're ready, grab a blanket, settle in, and let the walls close in, softly of course. Welcome to when royal palaces became prisons. There's a certain irony to it, isn't there? You spend your life building walls to keep the world out, and then one day, those same walls keep you in. Kings and queens surrounded by guards, gold and courtiers, but no freedom. A palace can feel like heaven until the door locks from the outside. Let's start with someone who knew that feeling all too well. Mary, Queen of Scots, the royal guest who couldn't leave. Mary Stuart, born in a palace, crowned at 9 months old, and, as history insists, destined to spend half her life in captivity, which is really just royal-sounding code for glorified house arrest. Her story begins in Scotland, which, if you've ever been there, is basically mist, castles, and political backstabbing. Mary had it all: the beauty, the bloodline, and the very unfortunate luck of being a queen surrounded by men who wanted her job. After her disastrous marriage to Lord Darnley, a man whose main achievement was being spectacularly murdered in a suspicious explosion, Mary's reign sort of imploded. She fled to England, hoping her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, might offer her shelter, or at least a decent guest room. Elizabeth did offer her a room, and then another, and another, for 19 years. Because when a royal guest overstays her welcome, that's called imprisonment with extra steps. Now, Elizabeth didn't exactly throw Mary into a dungeon. That would have been too uncivilized, and far too damp for royal bones. Instead, she kept her in a rotating series of castles and manors across England. Now, Elizabeth didn't exactly throw Mary into a dungeon. That would have been too uncivilized, and far too damp for royal bones. Instead, she kept her in a rotating series of castles and manors across England, places with names like Tutbury, Sheffield, and Chartley. Each one had slightly different decor, but the same central feature: guards. Lots of them. Mary's days were quiet. She prayed, embroidered, and occasionally plotted Elizabeth's assassination, as one does when your cousin's holding you hostage in velvet captivity. Her captors made sure she had comforts, servants, fine meals, even her own furniture. But the windows were barred, and the exits were locked. Imagine it. Golden chandeliers overhead, tapestries on the walls, and the soft echo of footsteps that aren't yours, guards pacing outside your door. A palace that feels like a cage. Mary aged in those rooms. Her once famous beauty faded, her health declined, and her letters, filled with Catholic hope and coded schemes, eventually betrayed her. In 1587, she was executed at Fotheringhay Castle, after nearly 2 decades of luxurious imprisonment. A queen, decapitated not for treason alone, but for being too dangerous to leave free. Let's drift eastward now. Another palace. Another prisoner. But this time, it's not Tudor England. It's Russia. where confinement came with chandeliers, orthodox icons, and very chilly corridors. Tsar Ivan VI, the baby who was born a prisoner. If you thought your childhood was rough, try being Tsar Ivan VI. He was crowned Emperor of Russia at just 2 months old, which, to be fair, is a solid resume line for an infant. But within a year, his family was overthrown by a distant relative, the future Empress Elizabeth, who decided the empire didn't need another baby in charge. So, what do you do with a deposed royal toddler? In Russia, apparently, you hide him. Ivan was taken away, first with his parents, then alone, shuttled between fortresses and monasteries. No one outside his guards even knew what he looked like. He spent his life in silence, a human secret, locked in a palace-shaped box. By the time he reached adulthood, Ivan had no idea what freedom meant. He'd never left his gilded cells, never met a friend, never ruled a single day. When Catherine the Great came to power decades later, she discovered this living ghost, the forgotten Tsar locked away like a cursed relic. She considered freeing him for about 5 minutes, before deciding that would be politically inconvenient. Ivan died the way he lived, behind walls, killed by his own guards during an escape attempt he barely understood. A man born to rule an empire, but never allowed to step outside his room. And maybe that's the thing about royal captivity. It's never about iron bars or chains. It's about being surrounded by everything, except choice. Let's move a little closer to Western Europe again, where the air smells faintly of perfume and political betrayal. Because if Mary and Ivan were prisoners of circumstance, the next monarch was a prisoner of appearance. Marie Antoinette, the queen who couldn't escape herself. Ah yes, Marie Antoinette. The woman who allegedly told her starving people to eat cake, which she didn't, but at this point, history isn't really in the business of fact-checking. Born in Vienna, shipped off to France at 14 to marry the Dauphin. She lived her youth as a walking symbol of elegance, excess, and mild confusion. Versailles was her home, her stage, her trap. Because Versailles, as palaces go, wasn't built for comfort. It was built for surveillance, a place where nobles elbowed for attention, and every royal sneeze had witnesses. Privacy didn't exist. Marie's mornings began with courtiers dressing her like she was a public art installation. She tried to carve out solitude, retreating to her little cottage, the Petit Trianon, where she played shepherdess, with silk ribbons and porcelain milk pails, naturally. But even there, she was still the queen, still watched, still trapped in the golden fishbowl of monarchy. When the revolution came, that fishbowl shattered, but not in the liberating way. Marie and Louis XVI were moved from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, their new home, heavily guarded, surrounded by mobs and soldiers. Then to the Temple prison. Then to the conciergerie, the stone waiting room of the guillotine. The queen who once ruled the most glittering court in Europe ended her days in a small damp cell, hair cut short, hands bound, dignity quietly crumbling. Versailles had been her palace. The conciergerie became her mirror, showing her what all that beauty had really been worth. So far, we've had queens and emperors, toddlers and revolutionaries, all trapped behind walls that once symbolized safety. And there are so many more, each palace a little world of its own, echoing with quiet footsteps and unspoken regrets. But before we drift to the next royal ghost in their velvet cage, take a breath. The story moves slowly here. History, after all, doesn't rush when it's standing still. Because we're heading even deeper into the echoing corridors of royal loneliness, where the carpets are soft, the ceilings high, and the exits sealed shut. If part 1 was about queens who traded thrones for silence, part 2 is about emperors who learned that power can vanish behind their own palace gates. So let's dim the lights again, take a slow breath, and drift toward the east. To a boy who was born a god, and died as a museum piece. Emperor Pu Yi, the last emperor in his own cage. If there's one royal who defined luxury as imprisonment, it's Puyi. Born in 1906, he was crowned Emperor of China at the age of 2. And if that sounds like an impressive career milestone, remember, he didn't actually do anything. At the Forbidden City in Beijing, he sat on a throne taller than he was, while grown men bowed to him and called him Son of Heaven. It must have been confusing. Imagine being told you rule all under heaven, but you still need permission to have snacks. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912, little Puyi technically abdicated, though he had no idea what that meant. The revolutionaries decided to let him stay in the palace. Because, what harm could a toddler emperor possibly do? So there he stayed. A dethroned emperor still living in imperial splendor, surrounded by eunuchs, courtyards, and ancient rituals that no longer meant anything. The world outside was changing. Inside the Forbidden City, Puyi was frozen in time. A relic in silk robes, ruling no one, imprisoned by ceremony. His life was a strange mixture of opulence and emptiness. He had everything except freedom, and eventually, he wasn't even allowed that. When he was expelled from the Forbidden City in 1924, he drifted between foreign powers, Japanese handlers, and his own delusions of returning to power. By the 1930s, Japan had found a use for him, as the puppet emperor of their colony Manchukuo. They gave him palaces again, guards, titles, all the decor of a monarchy, except the power. It was captivity masquerading as majesty. Every move he made was scripted, every word monitored. His throne was made of gold, but his leash was invisible. When Japan lost World War II, Puyi was captured, again, this time by the Soviets. He spent years in prison camps, then was handed over to Communist China, where he became a humble gardener. From Son of Heaven to assistant botanist. He later wrote, with calm irony, that prison was the first time he'd ever felt free. Because for the first time, he wasn't pretending to be a god. Let's float westward, from Beijing's courtyards to the windy, salty loneliness of the Mediterranean, where one man built an empire, and then spent his final years pacing a rock. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of Nowhere. Napoleon is one of those figures who's either a hero, a tyrant, or, if you're British, an extremely short inconvenience. He rose from nothing, conquered Europe, crowned himself emperor, and then learned the hard way that geography doesn't forgive arrogance. After losing his first empire, he was sent into exile on the island of Elba. Now, Elba sounds exotic, but it's really just a scenic rock with a few goats and far too many hills. Napoleon, being Napoleon, immediately started acting like it was a mini France. He built a palace, formed a tiny army, held parades, basically turned exile into cosplay. But the funny thing about being an emperor on a small island is that everyone knows you can't leave. Every step, every letter, every visitor, watched. Freedom, but fenced in by sea. And because Napoleon's ego was too large for Elba, he escaped, naturally, to reclaim France, which went about as well as you'd expect. A brief comeback. A crushing defeat. And then the final act, St. Helena. If Elba was a gilded retreat, St. Helena was a punishment. A volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, so remote that even birds looked bored. He spent 6 years there pacing, dictating his memoirs, and arguing with his British jailers about furniture arrangements. His palace was a damp farmhouse. His court was reduced to a few loyal servants. His empire, a fading memory in the fog. When he finally died in 1821, they buried him under a willow tree. A man who once ruled millions, ending his days as a captive tourist attraction. It's strange how often that happens, isn't it? How the throne and the prison cell can end up looking eerily alike. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, the queen who locked herself away. Now, let's glide to Vienna, where chandeliers sparkle, waltzes echo, and one empress spent her life running away from her own palace. Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, was, in theory, the most glamorous woman in 19th century Europe. In practice, she was miserable. Married young to Emperor Franz Joseph, she entered a world of rules, routines, and endless etiquette. The Habsburg court was like living inside a clock. Every hour, every meal, every breath accounted for. And Sisi hated it. She was beautiful, yes, the sort of beauty that painters idealized and poets wrote about. But she was also trapped. Every movement watched, every word whispered about, every emotion documented in public gossip. So she began to escape. Physically, at first, traveling constantly, spending as little time as possible in Vienna. Then emotionally, disappearing into poetry, melancholy, and obsessive fitness routines that made her attendants dizzy. They said she had the freedom of an empress. But freedom means nothing when you can't go anywhere without being followed by 100 eyes. In the end, her palace was her prison, and her escape was movement itself. She died far from home, in Geneva, killed by an assassin who didn't even know who she was. A woman who spent her life trying to vanish. Finally did. It's strange how many of these royal stories end the same way. Not in glory or conquest, but in stillness. In long hallways. In locked doors. In the quiet realization that power doesn't protect you from being trapped, it just gives your cage better curtains. Let's drift gently now, toward one last story before the night gets deeper. A king who ruled, abdicated, and learned that love can be its own form of confinement. Edward VIII, the king who chose his cage. Edward VIII had everything a modern monarch could want. Fame, charm, adoration, and a perfectly good empire. And then he fell in love with Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite. The British government said, absolutely not. The church said, even more absolutely not. So Edward said, well, I'll just quit then. In 1936, he abdicated, stepping down from the throne for what he called the woman I love. It sounded romantic at the time. In reality, it was just the beginning of another kind of confinement. After the abdication, Edward became the Duke of Windsor, with all the trappings of royalty and none of the relevance. He and Wallis lived in exile, moving between villas, manors, and palaces they didn't own, adored by the press and ignored by history. They threw parties. They smiled for photographers. They wore crowns made of nostalgia. But under all that glitter, there was something hollow, the same emptiness that echoes through every palace-turned-prison. A man who gave up the crown, only to realize that the world had already locked him out. Power, it turns out, is never just about control. It's about the illusion of freedom, and the quiet horror of realizing it was never yours. So if you're still here, still drifting through these stories, remember that the walls of history are full of echoes. Of queens who embroidered their own despair. Of emperors who wrote memoirs no one read. Of kings who traded freedom for love, and found they'd only changed the shape of the cage. The palaces are empty now. The guards are gone. But somewhere in the silence, the floorboard still creak, softly. Not from ghosts. Just from memory. Hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially outlasted several monarchies. We floated through the lonely gardens of exiled emperors and runaway queens, and now we're gliding into the colder, quieter prisons. the kind that hide behind polite smiles and chandeliers. Let's start with a man who ruled half of Europe but couldn't control his own palace. A king who learned that absolute power was often just an absolute mess. King George III, the monarch who lost his mind and his freedom. George III, the British king who managed to lose America, his sanity, and eventually, his own liberty. He reigned for 60 years, which sounds impressive until you realize that for a good chunk of that time, he wasn't really in charge. By the end of his life, George was trapped not by rebels or invaders, but by his own mind. Madness, they called it then. Probably a mix of bipolar disorder and a genetic blood condition called porphyria. But back then, mental health wasn't a concept, it was a scandal. When the fits began, the royal doctors rushed in with the 18th century equivalent of therapy: leeches, bleeding, and shouting. The palace staff whispered. Ministers panicked. And the royal family did what royal families often do when things get uncomfortable. They hid him. George was confined to Windsor Castle, his windows barred, his letters filtered. He wandered the halls singing hymns, speaking to the portraits, sometimes convinced he was talking to angels. The King of England had become a patient. His court turned into a sick room, his crown little more than a memory. And yet, his confinement was dignified in the strangest way. He wasn't chained or humiliated. He was simply forgotten. When he died in 1820, blind and alone, the official bulletin spoke gently, His Majesty passed peacefully. Which was true. But it didn't mention that his final years had been spent as a ghost in his own castle. Let's quietly sail north now, to Sweden, where another monarch discovered that you can abdicate the throne, but never the expectations that come with it. Queen Christina of Sweden, the philosopher in the cage. Christina was not your typical 17th century monarch. She was brilliant, eccentric, allergic to marriage, and suspiciously fond of wearing men's clothes. Which, for a Lutheran kingdom obsessed with order and heirs, was awkward. She ruled Sweden from 1632 to 1654, after inheriting the throne as a child. Her court called her the Northern Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, though privately, they thought she was a bit too clever for her own good. Christina loved art, literature, and philosophy, basically everything her advisors found unproductive. They wanted a queen to marry and produce an heir. She wanted to talk about Descartes. Eventually, she abdicated, voluntarily, shocking everyone. She said she was tired of the crown's burden. In reality, she was tired of being trapped by it. But her escape didn't bring peace. After converting to Catholicism and moving to Rome, she found herself confined in a different way. By gossip, religion, and suspicion. Her new freedom was just another form of exile. She lived in a lavish palace, surrounded by scholars and intrigue, spending her days writing letters and her nights hosting salons where everyone debated whether she was a genius or insane. Christina once said, "I was born free, and I will die free." But when she did die in 1689, it was in yet another palace, her rooms filled with books, paintings, and the same solitude she had tried so hard to escape. Now, let's move south, to Russia. A land where palaces were as grand as they were dangerous. Where family dinners sometimes came with a side of assassination. And where one woman decided that her husband's incompetence was grounds for career advancement. Peter III of Russia, the emperor who lasted 6 months. Peter III wasn't supposed to be emperor for long, and history made sure of it. He was the husband of Catherine the Great, a man whose greatest achievements included insulting the army, alienating the nobles, and making everyone deeply uncomfortable. Peter loved Prussia more than Russia, idolized Frederick the Great, and reportedly spent more time playing with toy soldiers than governing real ones. His court thought he was childish. His wife thought he was dangerous. When Catherine staged her coup in 1762, it was swift, efficient, and terrifyingly polite. Peter was forced to abdicate and sent to a quiet country palace under protective custody. Translation: he was imprisoned with a good view. He lasted just 8 days. Officially, he died of hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, he was strangled, possibly by Catherine's supporters, possibly by accident. It's hard to say. Russia is excellent at unclear endings. But what's strange about Peter's story is how ordinary it felt, at least by royal standards. Because in Russia, imprisonment was practically part of the job description. Ivan VI, the forgotten Tsar. Before Peter III, there was Ivan VI, a baby emperor who never even got to rule. Crowned as an infant in 1740, he was overthrown before his first birthday and spent his entire life locked away in various fortresses. He grew up in silence, never learning to read or speak properly. His only company the guards who rotated to make sure he didn't form attachments. By adulthood, he barely understood who he was. When a group of soldiers tried to free him in 1764, the guards panicked and killed him on the spot. No one was punished. The Empress simply ordered the prison cell sealed. A lifetime of royal blood, reduced to an unmarked grave. You start to notice a pattern after a while, don't you? For every coronation, there's a locked room somewhere waiting. For every crown, a key turned quietly in the dark. Maria Theresa of Spain, the queen who faded in her own palace. Let's visit one more, Madrid, 17th century. Maria Theresa, the Spanish queen and wife of Louis XIV of France. She was born into grandeur, married into even grander misery. Louis, the Sun King, had mistresses, wars, and mirrors to adore himself in. Maria had embroidery. She lived in Versailles, the most beautiful prison in Europe. Endless corridors, gilded ceilings, hundreds of courtiers, and not one real friend. They said she smiled sweetly and spoke little. She was surrounded by people every moment of her life, yet completely alone. When she died, Louis barely paused before returning to his mistresses. Her rooms were cleaned, her portraits moved, and that was that. Versailles went on glittering, but one of its brightest lights had quietly gone out, unnoticed. So much of royalty, when you look closely, is really just elegant captivity. Gilded walls. Golden cages. Some locked by enemies. Some by duty. Some by the weight of expectation. And the strangest thing? They all believed, at some point, that they were free. Soft pause. So, if you're still awake, we'll keep floating in the next part, to even darker corners. To emperors in exile, queens in towers, and princes who never saw daylight again. Because history's most beautiful prisons weren't always made of stone. Sometimes, they were built out of power itself.
Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a time when central heating wasn't even a fever dream. And yet, somehow, people still insisted on building houses out of rock. Thick, cold, drafty, echoing stone. Because apparently, comfort was optional when you had feudal power and a moat. So dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket, maybe two. Because we're about to spend the night in a medieval castle. And trust me, you'll need them. We're talking about the surprisingly creative, sometimes downright questionable ways medieval people tried to stay warm through endless European winters. Let's drift back, not to the glorious battlefields or glittering banquets, but to the real, unglamorous question. How did anyone survive inside a medieval castle when it was basically a stone refrigerator with a draft problem? The castle, a freezer with flags now. First of all, a castle was never meant to be cozy. It was meant to be impressive. You didn't build one to say, "Welcome home, friends." You built it to say, "Try attacking me, and good luck not freezing while you do it." Stone walls, thick and tall, were perfect for defense, and terrible for warmth. They trapped cold, they radiated cold, and they held onto cold like your ex holds onto grudges. You could light a fire in every room, and by the time you'd gotten one side warm, the other side would already be frosting over again. And yes, castles looked amazing in summer. Banners flying, sunlight glinting off turrets. But the moment November hit, those same grand halls turned into wind tunnels. Imagine sitting down for dinner while your soup freezes in real time. So what did medieval people do about it? Did they invent early heating systems? Nope. Did they suffer quietly and invent passive-aggressive complaints centuries before the Victorians? Absolutely. But they also got creative. The Great Hall, center of cold and occasional fire. Let's start with the heart of any medieval castle, the Great Hall, the social, political, and dining hub. It was also the one place where you had any real shot at not losing a toe to frostbite. In the middle of the hall was the hearth, a giant open fire pit, not tucked away in a fireplace, but literally in the center of the room. You could throw on a few logs, gather your household around, and bask in what might generously be described as lukewarm survival. Smoke from this giant open fire didn't exactly go up a chimney, because chimneys, as it turns out, were kind of a luxury invention that came later. Instead, the smoke rose up into the rafters, swirled around for a while, stained everything black, and eventually maybe escaped through a hole in the roof, the so-called louver. If the wind was right, the smoke would go out. If it wasn't, congratulations. You just invented indoor camping. Eyes watering, lungs wheezing, everything smelling like burnt mutton and wet wool. But hey, it was warm. Kind of. Floors of straw, walls of tapestries. So, let's say you're a 13th century noble trying not to shiver to death while pretending to enjoy your venison stew. What else could you do? Well, start with the floor. Stone floors were basically medieval ice rinks, so people covered them with layers of rushes, dried plants, reeds, straw, anything vaguely insulating. They'd sprinkle sweet herbs in there too, like lavender or thyme, partly for the smell, and partly because floor hygiene wasn't a phrase that existed yet. It helped a little, but it also created a home for, bugs, mice, and the occasional medieval surprise. So every few months, someone would scrape up the old straw and spread down a new layer, as though that was a normal part of civilized life. And on the walls, you didn't hang art, you hung tapestries. Giant embroidered wall hangings weren't just decoration, they were insulation. Thick wool or silk panels helped block drafts, absorb echoes, and make those stone walls slightly less tomb-like. Of course, not everyone had fancy tapestries. The average castle servant just slept next to the wall and hoped their blanket didn't freeze to it overnight. Bedrooms, drafty luxury. Now, bedrooms in castles were, well, let's call them aspirational. You might think the lord and lady of the castle had it easy. Their own chamber, private fireplace, featherbed. But even the nicest medieval bedroom could feel like a crypt in January. Yes, some had fireplaces, but the smoke control was terrible. You could either have warmth or breathable air, not both. And when the fire burned out in the middle of the night, which it always did, the room cooled instantly. That's why medieval beds were so elaborate. Heavy wooden frames, thick mattresses stuffed with straw, furs, blankets, quilts, and the real MVP, bed curtains. Those weren't just decorative. They trapped your body heat inside a little pocket of warmth. It's basically the medieval equivalent of a sleeping bag fort. Servants, of course, had a slightly less glamorous setup. They'd sleep in the hallways, near the kitchen, or right by the hearth. Warmth over comfort. And if you were unlucky enough to be a guard stationed on the battlements, yeah, your shift came with free frostbite. Kitchens, the real hotspot. If you wanted actual heat, you went to the kitchen. Castle kitchens were full of fire. Ovens, hearths, spits, cauldrons, and probably smelled like a strange mix of roasting meat, burnt bread, and desperation. The cooks were the warmest people in the building, though probably also the most exhausted. That's why you'll often find that servants or guards like to just happen to wander near the kitchen when off duty. Not to sneak food. Okay, maybe a little. But mainly because it was the one place where you could actually feel your fingers again. Some larger castles even had a separate room called a warming chamber, where laundry was dried and guests thawed themselves before daring to go back out. It was the medieval equivalent of standing by a radiator for 30 minutes pretending to check your phone. Hot water, cold comfort. Bathing in winter was optional, and for good reason. If you were rich, you might have a small bathing tub brought into your chamber. Servants would heat water in the kitchen and lug it up, bucket by bucket, while you tried not to think about how fast it was cooling. Bathing was a luxury, not a habit. And when you did it, you'd probably add herbs or petals. Again, partly for smell, partly because everyone believed certain plants warmed the humours. Poorer folk, they just hoped spring would come early. Clothing, layering like a medieval onion. Since architecture wasn't doing much for warmth, people turned to fashion. Medieval clothing was all about layering. Wool tunics, linen shirts, cloaks, fur-trimmed hoods, long stockings. Basically, they dressed like everyone was always 5 minutes away from a snowstorm. And no, they didn't all wear drab browns and greys. Wealthy people loved bright colours, deep reds, blues, greens, dyed with expensive pigments. It made them look important and slightly less like they were dying of hypothermia. The truly fancy had fur linings. Squirrel, marten, ermine if you were royal. Because because nothing says I'm warm and superior like being wrapped in small woodland creatures. Let's float over to another winter trick. Body heat economics. When all else failed, there was always the simplest heat source: other people. Servants slept side by side in the hall. Families huddled together in bed. Even animals sometimes came indoors for warmth. There's historical evidence that livestock were kept in lower floors or adjoining rooms in smaller keeps. Not just for protection, but for heat. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And when the alternative is freezing alone, you get real comfortable with the smell of hay and goat breath. Castles in the north. The real ice palaces now. You might think this was just an English or French problem. But oh no. Go farther north, and the challenge got extreme. Scotland, Scandinavia, northern Germany. All full of castles that looked romantic but functioned like meat lockers. The Norse and Scots were at least somewhat used to the cold though. They layered furs, built smaller keeps with thicker walls, and used peat fires that burned long and hot. Even so, medieval chroniclers loved to complain about bitter winters, as if nature was personally out to get them. Which honestly, it kind of was. And that's where we'll leave things for tonight's stretch of Castle Survival 101. Open fires, smoky halls, straw-covered floors, and the noble art of pretending to be warm while slowly freezing to death. But don't worry. In part 2, we'll wander deeper into the cold stone corridors to explore how royalty coped differently from servants, how heating technology evolved, and why even kings sometimes slept in their clothes until April. So pull the blanket a little tighter. Let the fire crackle in your imagination. And remember, no matter how drafty your room feels tonight, at least you're not sleeping in a medieval tower with an open roof vent for ventilation. Part 2. Royal Warmth. How kings and queens survived the medieval winter. Soft wind hums through imaginary castle towers as the fire crackles, faintly in the background. Welcome back, my brave blanket-wrapped listener. You've made it through the drafty great hall, the smoky hearths, and the questionable straw carpets. And now, we're heading into the royal chambers themselves. Because if you thought servants had it bad, just wait until you realize how miserable it could be to be royalty in a stone fortress during a medieval winter. Sure, you had titles, gold, and the occasional fur-lined robe, but you were still sleeping in what was basically a refrigerator with curtains. Let's float gently from the kitchens and halls into the upper floors, where kings and queens tried, and mostly failed, to make winter tolerable. The royal bedchamber, drafts, drapes, and desperation. The royal bedchamber might sound luxurious, and in paintings it certainly looks it. A grand canopied bed, carved wood, velvet drapes, and maybe a roaring fire in the corner. But the reality, still cold. So cold, in fact, that even the fire didn't help much. The walls radiated chill like a glacier. The windows leaked a wind like broken flutes. And the massive open spaces never trapped heat for long. Royalty fought back with layers. Not just of clothing, of everything. A good royal bed had a straw mattress, a feather topper, woolen sheets, fur blankets, and thick curtains that closed completely around the bed, forming what was basically a private tent. Inside it could be several degrees warmer than the rest of the room. A medieval miracle. Of course, it wasn't exactly romantic. The air got stale, the fire went out, and you'd wake up to see your breath fogging in front of your face. The kind of scene that makes you question whether absolute power was really worth it. When in doubt, sleep in your clothes. Let's be honest. The medieval approach to winter sleep was simple. Don't undress. Even royals, with all their silk and status, often just crawled into bed wearing their undertunics, stockings, and sometimes even gloves. Because why risk hypothermia when fashion can wait till April? There are even accounts of nobles sleeping with small hoods on their heads, little cloth caps tied under the chin to keep the ears warm. Forget golden crowns. The real symbol of winter royalty was the nightcap. And no, they didn't change those sheets often, because laundry in a castle was a logistical nightmare involving boiling water, hauling, drying by firelight, and prayer. So people tended to rely on perfume, herbs, and denial. Chimneys, the medieval game changer. Now, at some point, humanity decided that maybe, just maybe, all the smoke in the living room was a problem. That's when the chimney entered the chat. Chimneys began appearing in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, first in monasteries and wealthy homes. It was a total revolution in heating. Instead of one smoky hearth in the middle of a room, you could now have multiple fireplaces on different floors, each with a flue that carried smoke neatly out of the building. The downside? Chimneys were expensive to build, tricky to maintain, and had an unfortunate habit of catching fire. Still, they were a huge step up from, let's just make a bonfire indoors and hope for the best. Castles like Dover and Kenilworth in England eventually got elaborate chimney systems, with fireplaces big enough to roast an ox, which, coincidentally, was sometimes exactly what they were used for. The warming pan and other medieval inventions. Even with fireplaces, bedrooms could still feel like meat lockers. That's where a few clever little tools came in. One was the warming pan, a small metal pan with a long handle, filled with hot coals and slid between the bed sheets before sleeping. Think of it as a 14th century electric blanket, minus the electricity, and plus a small risk of setting your mattress on fire. Then there were foot warmers, little boxes with embers placed under your feet while you sat, and bed socks, though they didn't call them that, of course. They just wore layers until movement became optional. For the wealthy, fur-lined robes and heavy cloaks were essential indoor fashion. You didn't wear your house wore you, the servant's lot, living by the hearth. While royalty fought drafts in velvet, the servants had more direct tactics. Proximity to fire. They slept in kitchens, hallways, near ovens, anywhere the warmth lingered. Of course, that also meant they slept surrounded by smoke, rats, and sometimes the delightful sound of dripping fat from the roasting spits above. But still, warm is warm. In the morning, before the lords and ladies even stirred, servants had to relight the fires, fetch wood, and air out the chambers, which meant starting every freezing morning outside, carrying logs, and coming back in just to inhale another dose of smoke. It's a miracle any of them lived long enough to become characters in history books. Heating the castle strategically. By the late Middle Ages, castle architects started getting smarter about heat. They began designing keeps with smaller rooms, easier to warm, and adding fireplaces in private chambers. Some even experimented with early underfloor heating systems, inspired by ancient Roman hypocausts. The Romans had perfected this centuries earlier. Hot air from a furnace flowed under raised floors, warming the rooms above. Medieval engineers tried to replicate it, mostly in monasteries or royal bathhouses, but it never quite caught on widely. Too expensive, too complex, too easy to smoke yourself out. Still, the idea shows they were thinking about comfort, slowly, begrudgingly, but surely. A king's winter routine. Let's peek into a royal winter day, just to set the scene. You wake up in your massive canopy bed, half buried in furs. Your breath fogs in the air, the coals in the fireplace are barely glowing, and a servant is quietly tiptoeing in with new logs. You stay in bed until the room is warm enough to move without shattering. Breakfast is usually served in the side chamber, close to the kitchen. Because walking through a freezing hall first thing in the morning was a level of bravery reserved for knights. Throughout the day, fires burned in every occupied room, and the rest of the castle was simply abandoned to the cold. Entire wings could go unused for months, their doors shut tight to keep what little heat there was contained. And at night, the same process in reverse. Fires damped down, tapestries drawn tight, and everyone wrapped in wool until morning. It's not exactly Versailles-level glamour, but it kept the blood flowing. Barely. Monasteries and monks, cold but composed. Interestingly, one group handled cold better than anyone: monks. Medieval monasteries were models of stoic endurance. Monks followed strict schedules, up before dawn, prayers in unheated chapels, hours spent copying manuscripts in icy scriptoria. Their solution wasn't luxury, it was layers and discipline. Wool robes, fingerless gloves, and sometimes even heated stones placed under their desks to keep their hands from going numb while writing. If you've ever complained about typing in a cold room, just imagine illuminating a Bible with a quill while your ink freezes mid-letter. Castles and candles. The subtle heat. One often overlooked source of warmth. Candles. Not much, but in a world without electricity, every flame counted. A few dozen beeswax candles burning in a closed chamber could actually raise the temperature a degree or two. Not to mention fill the air with a faintly sweet smell, and soot. For the nobility, beeswax candles were a luxury item, bright, clean-burning, and expensive. Servants and common folk may do with tallow candles, cheaper, smellier, and prone to dripping. But either way, when night came early and the cold pressed in, even a few flickering flames made all the difference. Let's drift over to a colder corner of history now. Not all medieval castles were created equal. Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, southern France had far milder winters, so their castles focused more on staying cool in the summer than warm in the winter. But move north, say, to England, Germany, or Scandinavia, and architecture started looking more like armor than housing. Thick walls, narrow windows, smaller chambers, all built to trap what little warmth existed. The irony, of course, is that the grander the castle, the colder it usually was. The rich built monuments to power, and then spend the rest of their lives trying to survive inside them. The smell of medieval warmth. Now, it's worth remembering that warmth came with ambiance. Every fire meant smoke. Every fur meant animal musk. The air was thick with a mix of soot, sweat, wood, and old meat. This wasn't the clean, cozy log cabin scent we imagine today. It was more campfire and compost, with notes of survival. And yet, for people of the time, that was home. Warmth and smoke were comforting because they meant life. If you could smell the fire, you knew you weren't freezing to death. Yet. Royal guests and the politics of warmth. Hosting visitors in winter was a row.